On the bench today, we've got a brand new basher, the Maverick Quantum2 XT Flux Truggy. And if this thing turns out to be any good, it could be better than the Traxxas Rustler and Arrma Vorteks for less money than both. I think this brand new body looks really, really nice. This thing comes in a couple of colors. I chose green. You get green wheels with that. Holding that body on are some body clips with nice, strong body clip retainers. Whether or not you like body clips or a clipless body system is kind of personal preference. At least with body clips, the body's never gonna come flying off. And this body is pretty good. It feels nice and thick. I think manufacturers are really starting to understand that just a couple extra cents in this body plastic will make it last a lot longer and make their customers a lot happier. Underneath that body is a brand new platform from Maverick, which is owned by HPI, that shares basically nothing with the previous Quantum line. And there are some features in here that you can't get from the equivalent Traxxas or Arrma, even with the Platinum Rustler that costs twice as much as this. And one of those features is an all-metal drivetrain, including a steel center drive shaft, steel front CVDs, as well as rear dog bones that are connected to all steel differentials. We'll be taking a look at those in just a minute. This 3S capable 80 amp ESC is connected to a 3660 brushless motor. This truck is only 3S capable, but don't worry, if it survives 3S, we're definitely going to be going 4S with it. The included manual, which is reasonably thorough, states that this thing can be driven in wet conditions, but is not designed to be completely submerged. I suspect this is going to be primarily due to the receiver box and the receiver. We'll take a closer look at that receiver and see just how water resistant it looks in just a second. Just like the Vorteks and Rustler, this does not have a center differential out of the box. Let's take a look at that slipper clutch. To get to that, we'll have to take off this included center brace. First impressions on the hardware is that it seems pretty decent. It does have labeling on it, which is usually a good sign, and it does appear to be high quality. It fits nicely with these MIP bits. The quality of the vehicle fasteners is pretty important because you're going to be interacting with them all the time when you're working on it. We can work on the back without completely removing the center brace, but it will be easier if we take the front out as well. This center brace is heavy and feels like a solid aluminum rod, not just an aluminum tube. I did try to take these ends off, but they're in there pretty good, so we'll just leave them be. As you can see here, it does appear that the slipper clutch is externally adjustable. And under this cover, we can see we have a steel pinion gear on a motor mount that is not infinitely adjustable. This is good for beginners and it has a range from 12 to 16 teeth, but there are certain combinations of gears that may not work properly with the preset mesh. I prefer an infinitely adjustable mount, but there are advantages and disadvantages to both ways. This motor, along with the ESC, are obviously Hobbywing. This is a 3500 kV motor, which is ideal for 3S, but it's gonna be a little spicy for 4S, which I do wanna try on this car, assuming it survives 3S. Obviously, we're gonna have to swap out this ESC, but I'm gonna want to see what this drivetrain's really capable of. As we can see down here, the one plastic piece of this drivetrain is going to be the spur gear, and we do have a fairly standard looking slipper clutch in here. As you can see here, HPI does have a bunch of upgrades available for this car, which I think is really smart. One of those is an upgraded steel spur gear, so you can go truly all metal on this drivetrain if you want to. Speaking of the drivetrain and upgrades, I want to see what it takes to get one of these differentials out. First step is to take off this front bumper. It does form part of the A-block for the front suspension, though there is some steel reinforcement in here, so it's not completely plastic. This also has some decent looking front lights in it that are supposedly controllable by this surprisingly good feeling transmitter. This transmitter takes 4 batteries, has digital adjustment for your trims, endpoints, and steering dual rate, as well as it appears a 3rd and maybe even 4th channel on it. It's got a nice foam wheel and actually feels really good for this class of vehicle. And I think just with those 4 screws, we should be able to take this cover off and then pop the differential out. This is literally all we had to remove to get the differential out. That's really nice to see. And to be honest, I'm pretty sure this thing's gonna be able to handle 4S no problem whatsoever. This almost looks like a 1/8 scale differential. These output cups are huge. And this gear, while it does appear to be sintered steel, looks to be really good quality. The only disappointing thing are Phillips screws. Whereas I'm sure these Phillips, and I'm guessing self-tappers, yep, self-tapper screws, are gonna be just fine in this application. It just kind of brings the perceived quality of the whole truck down a little bit, and I'm really not sure why they have them in here, given that it appears like the whole rest of the truck is hexed machine screws. Before we take this apart, I do want to note that you cannot get these bearings off over the output cups, so if you want to change these bearings, you are going to have to take this apart, and the entire truck appears to have shielded bearings, not sealed bearings, which is definitely a little bit of a downgrade. Opening this up, we have another disappointment. There's a gasket in here, and I think this is a sealed differential, but they filled it with grease and not fluid. Like I've said previously, grease is okay. It's not really a problem, especially in these smaller vehicles, but it gives a perception of lower quality, and if you want to put fluid in them, having to clean all the grease out is a huge pain. I would definitely recommend that HPI Maverick switch to oil filling these differentials, especially given that they are completely sealed. There's really no reason to use grease in these. So overall, I would say a little bit of a mixed bag on the differentials. Fundamentally, it looks great. It's easy to get to. The outdrives are really nice, beefy, and well machined. The gear itself looks nice. Using Phillips self-tappers and grease internally is a little bit of a head scratcher here, especially again, given that it would cost them basically nothing to really improve the perceived quality of this part. Fortunately, they did use enough thick grease that there actually is some damping inside this differential, so it doesn't feel completely wide open like most grease-filled differentials do. When I first felt it, I was pretty sure this was going to be fluid-filled. While we have that out, we can see the steel pinion gear, the steel front CVDs, which are on pretty thick axles, the plastic lower arms, as well as plastic upper links. Those plastic upper links are joined by plastic tie rods. I know some people will complain about not having adjustable upper links and tie rods, but to be perfectly honest, most bashers are never going to adjust these as long as they're okay from the factory. And because of the added flexibility of this plastic, they can often be more durable than their steel adjustable counterparts. Speaking of steel and plastic, let's take a look at these shocks. These are plastic bodied with hybrid plastic aluminum caps. They are threaded. The lower ball is metal. Spring perches are not positively retained, and I do see a little bit of weeping here, so that makes me a little concerned that this is already leaking. Removing this upper cap, we can see we've got a diaphragm style shock in here, and then you can get a closer look at that hybrid plastic aluminum cap style. One thing about leaking shocks and differentials is I've noticed that a lot of times these things will leak in transport because of pressure changes during that transportation, and then they won't end up leaking in use. So seeing a little bit of wetness on the bottom of this shock is not inherently indicative that this thing's going to leak when we're using it. That's just one more thing we're going to have to find out when we bash it. Something you may not know is that the shock absorbers aren't the only things responsible for absorbing shock in a landing and going over bumps. The tires also play a big role in that. These tires are held on by nice, big, serrated nylock nuts. They're on thick aluminum 14mm hexes that actually look really nice. And the tires themselves feel pretty thick. They don't have really weak feeling sidewalls. They are fully glued on. They're on some decent looking wheels, and I really like this green color. Underneath those, we have an all plastic suspension. However, you can see we have bushings in the kingpins and in the hinge pins. Let me get this front end put back together, then we'll see just how waterproof these electronics look. Maverick claims that this truck is water resistant. I believe the ESC and the motor will be, but I'm not too sure about the servo or the receiver. Let's pull those out of there. So far, this truck definitely does seem to be a lesson in simplicity, as everything has been very easy to remove and work on. This servo claims to be waterproof. It appears to be metal geared. Let's take a quick look inside and make sure it's actually sealed up. If you love the deepest dives on YouTube into the latest RC car models, make sure you get subscribed. I love doing this kind of thing, and you subscribing tells me you love it too. Pulling a screw out of here, we can see, okay, we do not have an O-ring on this screw, so that tells me that this is not going to be a waterproof servo. It could still be water resistant, but without O-rings on those screws, water eventually is going to get inside, especially if this thing is put underwater, which of course the manual says not to do anyway, but I really do like to see O-rings on these screws. Let's see if the cases are gasketed. Yes, there is an O-ring on this case, which means at least water won't be getting in that way. Though it is interesting to see that this board is just sort of floating around in there. That's not really a sign of high quality, and it is possible with some serious abuse that something could get knocked loose on this board, and it's also not conformally coated, so it has no extra waterproofing. On the plus side, whereas the servo saver is plastic, it does have a steel Arrma bar, and it appears to be pretty easily adjustable. The receiver box is pretty easy to open with just one body clip. Obviously, this receiver box itself is not waterproof, and it's hard to tell if the receiver itself is. Let's pull it out of there and have a closer look. This receiver is actually screwed together, which is fairly unusual. They're normally clipped together or glued together. Hopefully, we're going to see at least some conformal coating on the inside of this to give it that water-resistant rating. Okay, we're seeing more than conformal coating here. The board on this receiver is actually completely encased in silicone, which means they've gone a long way to making sure that this thing isn't going to get damaged by water. This is probably the most waterproof receiver I've ever opened. I'm very impressed with this, and even though the receiver box itself is not waterproof, I can easily say that this receiver is not going to mind a little bit of water. But can this Quantum2 XT handle a little bit of abuse? Let's go find out. All right, 3S bone stock off-road. Let's see how fast she is. Definitely got some power. Full throttle. As she moves. Not too bad. One more pass. She definitely feels pretty wild. Let's see how fast that was. All right, 39 miles an hour out of the box. That is not terrible. Let's see how she bashes. So far, she feels pretty good. Almost 40 miles an hour on a pretty slippery off-road surface is nice out of the box. It handles fairly decently, though these tires don't get the best traction on that kind of surface. And it can clearly handle basic bashing. But we don't want to know if it can just handle basic bashing. We want to know if this thing can handle some real abuse. So let's put this brand new Castle Cobra 10 in here, put a 4S LiPo in and see how it handles that. This is probably going to be one of the easiest ESC swaps I've ever done. The receiver box is really easy to open. This is just being held on by double-sided tape. Disconnect the motor. And this ESC is out. And that's one thing I've noticed about this truck. It's kind of a lesson in simplicity. Nothing's terribly complicated. Everything's easy to work on. Overall, so far, I'm pretty impressed with it. The design of this platform is also really nice. It gives you plenty of room to put pretty much whatever ESC you would want in this car without having to do a bunch of modification. Looks like it's going to fit on there perfectly. Wires are going to reach over no problem. Let me get this thing wired up. We'll throw a 4S battery in this thing. Let's go see what this platform can really handle. So there we go, guys. Overall, I'm pretty impressed with this platform. That took some serious hits on 4S, and nothing in the suspension or the chassis broke. All the arms are still good. The drive shafts are still mostly straight. Wing mount and wheelie bar are still good. All the shocks are good and don't seem to be leaking. In general, it does roll fairly smooth, although it was getting a bit of a click at the end. I checked, and we do have a chipped tooth on the spur gear. That's not terribly surprising. I was running this on 4S, and the slipper clutch is cranked all the way down. That plastic spur gear was probably doomed. Fortunately, they do have an upgraded one available that you can buy. Speaking of buying things, a lot of times when you buy stuff that isn't Arrma or Traxxas, where you get it from becomes a big problem. Fortunately, A-Main's carrying this Maverick Quantum 2 line, so vehicles and parts should be pretty readily available. So should you buy the Maverick Quantum 2 XT Flux? I'd say it's a pretty compelling car. This thing's directly competing with the Rustler, and depending on which version of the Rustler you're talking about, this is between 60% and 50% of the price. For that price, you get a lot of the same features, some features like steel CVDs that you don't get in the Rustler or in the the Vorteks, which by the way, this is also quite a bit cheaper than, you've got access to a fairly extensive first-party upgrade catalog, and it is coming from HPI, which is a reputable brand. That being said, just like with the competition, you're dealing with a slipper clutch, and unfortunately, unlike the competition, there doesn't seem to be an option for a center differential for this. Traxxas has a first-party option for the Rustler, and you can put the 4S differentials into the 3S vehicles on the Arrma line. Whether or not that's actually a problem to you just depends on whether or not you like slipper clutches. I usually end up tightening them all the way down, then just dealing with the consequences. The consequence here, unfortunately, having been a chipped spur gear. Of course, don't forget, we were on 4S with a big, powerful ESC. Overall, out of the box, this thing's pretty quick. It handles reasonably well. It's got good features. And if you like the way this looks, I don't think you'd be upset if you owned one. I also don't think you'd be upset if you subscribed to this channel or checked out one of these videos.